I grew up listening to a lot of those stories about them from my father, who had listened to stories from one of those uncles, Alonzo Mitchell. When my father was a boy, he told my father many trail drive stories, and I was surprised in 2009 when I bought the Longhorn book by Dobie and saw all these quotes from my uncle in Dobie's book. So up to that time, I had been a fan of J. Frank Dobie. Alonzo and his brothers rounded up wild cattle in South Texas in the early 1870s and drove them to the Kansas railheads for shipment back east. And he had become acquainted with J. Frank Dobie, as Mary mentioned, in the 30s or 40s, maybe even in the 20s, we're not sure. But Alonzo was a good storyteller, which is why he probably became a friend of Dobie. And Dobie described him as a quiet little old man, a certain Chaucerian shyness and gentleness in him, and very religious. Dobie interviewed him when he was writing this book, and I'll quote some of those stories, and I'll paraphrase some in the interest of time because some of them are lengthy. And the first quote is from that Dobie quoted my uncle. He said, "That year, 1875, we were taking up a mixed herd to Wichita, Kansas. It was mixed sure enough, cows, bulls, and steers, no calves or yearlings. But by the time they got to the Brazos River, this was from South Texas going north, by the time they got to the Brazos River, some of the cows started having calves. Well, the calves could not keep up on the trail, so they had to either do away with them or get rid of them somehow. When they got into North Texas, they ran across a lady that wanted all the orphans. So she would show up at their camp each morning before daylight and pick up the dogie or orphan calves that had been dropped during the night. And they found out that she'd been doing that to all the herds. So she'd built up a pretty big herd of dogies. And I don't know how that woman raised all those baby calves, but she did a good job of it, they said. And they said she fared a lot better than Nestor, that they had a herd up in Kansas. They had bedded down a herd of steers. And this Nestor showed up after dark, said he wanted all the calves that they was going to have during the night. And the trail boss said, "Sure, you can have all the calves that are dropped tonight, but you got to help us with night herd. You got to stand guard tonight for us. And tomorrow morning you can get the calves." Well, as you know, steers don't have very many calves. So the next morning, the guy, when it got daylight, he looked around at all the animals and saw he'd been tricked. They said he jumped on his horse and left. Didn't even come to camp for coffee. And another story about their trail drives was they had a pair of big longhorns that stood 17 hands high. And they were their lead steers, and they used them on several drives. They wouldn't sell them. They named them Broad and Crump. Said Broad was a big dark brown steer with horns that just kept going straight out. And then the other one was a big white steer named Crump. His horns crumpled in on the ends. And those steers would walk. All the cowboys were amazed. Those steers would walk side by side, swinging their heads, leading the herd, mile after mile, day after day, and it took several months to get from South Texas to Kansas. And they would never poke each other with their horns and never click horns. So that was something amazing about them. But what was more important about those two steers is during a stampede, they didn't call them stampedes, they called them stampedes. That's what my uncle called it all through here. And J. Frank Dobie, through his whole book, calls them stampedes. During a stampede, these two steers would work their way to the head of the herd and run them in a mill. They'd call it a mill, and they'd just start circling, and that would settle the cattle down, and they'd bed them down for the night. And he said a funny thing was the next morning at around the campfire, during a stampede, which was caused usually by chain lightning, they called it, cloud to cloud chain lightning, and lobo wolves, or the smell of the lobo wolves. A lot of the cowboys, most of them, would start screaming and yelling and praying to God to make it through the night, through that storm, and so that they didn't get trampled and would be alive the next day. Then the next morning at camp, having coffee and breakfast, they'd be laughing about it, and they'd be back cursing and telling dirty jokes again. They'd forgotten all about all the praying they were doing. But they noticed that my uncle, Alonzo, did not pray. And I'll quote what he said, what they asked him. They said, "Don't you ever pray in a storm?" They'd ask me. No. Well, each man said to me at one time or another, "I pray when I get scared. I don't see how anybody keeps from it." I'll tell you, I said more than once, why I don't pray. When I was 21 years old, I gave my life to my Heavenly Father. I turned myself over to Him. I pray to Him regularly. And under His care, I'm no more scared when it lightens than when it don't. And then one story that I'll read verbatim straight out of the book, because I'll mess it up if I try to paraphrase it. He said, up in the Indian Nation, Oklahoma, somewhere south of a creek that I can't remember the name of, a man who was loose herding a small bunch of cattle met our herd one evening and told us we'd better expect trouble. Every herd that had crossed that creek, he said, was stampeding. According to him, a jayhawker was waylaying the place. And after the cattle ran and split up, was cutting off little bunches and driving them up a side canyon where he'd hold them until the owner of the herd had left the country, and then turn them over to a gang of fellow thieves. This creek had a reputation up and down the trail, but the crossing was steep and thickly timbered and had underbrush besides, all cut by gullies. The average herd did not have a man riding in front of it, the 2-point men guiding the leaders and holding them down if they got to walking too fast. My brother Bob Mitchell was trail boss, and when we started down to the creek bottom, he took his place on the right point. He didn't show himself, but as the lead cattle strung along with Broad and Crump right in front doing their duty, he rode so as to get a good look ahead. Directly he saw something black down in the bottom flop like two big wings. He pulled his 6-shooter and shot, and a man left on his horse in a hurry. Bob just got one look at him, one glimpse of him in the brush. We got across the creek okay. The stampeder left his paraphernalia right where he was in the habit of using it. It consisted of a kind of scarecrow with adjustable wings that could be moved up and down. When the lead animals of a herd suddenly saw this thing working these big black wings, of course it would spook them. And those in close quarters, of course, they tore out. Those following down the hill, breaking off from the narrow trail, opening and scattering from hell to breakfast. We made camp that night on the prairie. On the edge of it, next to the creek, were a lot of oak trees. A funny thing, next morning, the man who had been stone-feeding the herds was hanging from a limb of one of them trees, considerably off to one side of the trail so as not to scare any cattle. Right by him was hanging his scarecrow machine. He crawled up there and hung himself so he wouldn't stone-feed no more cattle. At least that's what they told me. And here the reader may visualize a little wink and hear a little imagination, a little laugh from the lean, lithe, and bright-eyed little man who told me this story when he was 85 years old. Thank you.
In your email, you mentioned that your father had grown up listening to the stories, and you mentioned it here too. Did he pass those stories along? I mean, and did he make sure? I mean, you said that he told them to you, but did he tell them over and over enough that you learned them to pass along to your sons and grandsons?
Well, I've always been enjoyed the Texas history, and especially family Texas history. I had some colorful guys in those, like that Bob Mitchell was a gunslinger, and hey, there's a lot of stories about him. And so I paid attention and I memorized the stories that I liked the stories. Mm-hmm. So I don't have any written down, but my grandsons, one of whom is here tonight, and the son, have told me I need to start writing some of these down.
And they're right. You do.
I'm 75, and while my mind is still good, I plan to write a book on these stories.
That'd be cool, yeah.
And those stories that my father told me, not one of them were in the book. So there was other stories.
There's more. There's more. You talked about the fact that you didn't realize there were stories in the book until you came across them.
Until I bought this book.
Were there still family members alive who knew about this, who knew about the relationship between Dobie and Alonzo?
I have an aunt. She's 80 years old now that knows some of the stories.
Did she share them?
She don't talk much about it.
Oh.
She has some letters and stuff that I'm going to get when I write this book.
Very good.
Family history.
Be sure you get them. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Standard, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us.